Everybody, welcome to the Beautiful Struggle. Just want to let everybody know the Black Advancement Inc. is a nonprofit organization that seeks to create a unity within the Black community through action and discussion. Today, we are going to talk about why the wealth gap still exists. With me, I have Alexis and Lauren, and I am Brandon. So we're going to go ahead and get this started. Alexis, we'll start it off with you. Why do you think the wealth gap still exists?
So I think the wealth gap still exists for a couple of reasons. And for one reason for sure is that history repeats itself. We have not corrected laws that were put into place during the Jim Crow era. We haven't corrected laws that were put into place, right after the Civil War, right after World War II, things of that nature. In addition to that, there's generational discriminatory practices that have not been corrected, and we have not really been able to go in and take a multi-tier look at various policies that affect African Americans or people of color. For example, last time you and I worked together, Brandon, we discussed the 1980s when drugs were rampant in the Black community, right? And we look at now when we're dealing with an opioid crisis. We still have not tackled crack cocaine in the Black community, but we're able to tackle opioid crisis where states, counties, cities are getting funding to assist with people that are using opioids. So we're compounding, in our current day and time, we're compounding issues on top of historic issues that have built up over the last 100, 200 years. In addition to that, we need or what has happened or why we have this issue is that we have not done a policy intervention in the sense that, if you look at mass incarcerations, right? After the Black Lives Movement protests during the summer of the George Floyd murder versus, the January 6th, we'll call it protest, to be politically correct here, but you have people that were protesting for Black lives and they received felony convictions when they were arrested, which means that they're going to have trouble finding jobs. They're going to have trouble getting, making a solid income or even going to school or, trade, things of that nature, right? Versus people that stormed the Capitol on January 6th and they were hit with misdemeanors. And it makes a difference, right? It makes a difference when you're looking at the overall system and how we are tackling policies, how we're repeating history, and then how we're compounding new policies, new laws, and everything else on top of the historical laws and policies that have already been in place.
Absolutely, great points. Lauren, how about you?
So I think it's important for us to recognize that America is a capitalist country. And so capitalism and white supremacy work together to create certain systems. And so when we look at generational wealth and kind of just wealth distribution in America in general, there's very succinct categories that in America you get wealth from. And so that is stocks, that is businesses, and largely that is real estate. And so there's a lot of different ways. Those are primarily the ways that people that have wealth and income in this country get them. And so what the challenge is that the richest 1% of America is held by maybe 10% of its residents. And so what happens is that not just for Black and Brown communities, but we have a disparity across the entire country. And that there's a big disparity. So I'm just going to read this. It says that in terms of financial wealth in 2013, so here we are in 2022, and we're still seeing the effects. The top 1% of household had 49.8% of all privately held stock, 54.7% of financial securities, 62.8% of business equity. The top 10% had 84 to 94% of stocks, bonds, trust funds, and business equity. So really what you see is that, when we're really having this kind of conversation and we're talking about, what has happened generationally, we have to also address the fact that there are just huge disparities, and that the large percentage of the wealth that we even have access to is really the bottom 20%, even if corrected properly. And so I think Alexis's point is very valid in saying that, you know, we have to have policies and procedures that are going to distribute that wealth a little bit more accurately. You have people that have privately held companies, for example, like the Jeff Bezos of the world, and not only him. I mean, there's lots of other, you know, wealth concentrations. These are individuals that set policies, or they pay for policies. These are individuals that make systemic change or block systemic change. These are people that are behind lobbyist groups. And so that really colors the advanced work that we can do in this country, you know, that are going to advance our agenda. So I think that's an important thing to kind of consider. Yes, we definitely do have a history for Black people in America of you know, having challenges with, you know, income and generational wealth. And yes, that is absolutely true. But it is also a bigger and global perspective, is that we need some support as well, so that it's not just the richest 10% of Americans are controlling the strings of the larger majority. But it's very difficult to kind of break that up, because that's the function of a capitalistic society, and that the small percentages are always making decisions for the larger majority. And until we, as a system of people, kind of join together as a majority and, you know, lobby and make some changes, that's kind of the system that we're in currently. And so I just think that, you know, for wealth specifically and why it persists, I think that it is the emphasis on profit. And I think that as long as there is a real emphasis in creating a triangle of wealth and maintaining these wealth disparities, we are going to continue to have a persistent wealth gap across many cultures.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with both of you more. You all brought up great points. I think wealth gap still exists to this day due to the fact of, you know, America's a capitalist society. And at the end of the day, capitalism is a system that is designed to run on its own, but it's a system that's designed to benefit those who know how to play the game. Additionally, there are several laws that could be in place to help stem the wealth gap, but truth be told, the people who control those laws want things to continue going as well. There's a report by Credit Suisse that said 45.8% of global household wealth is in the hands of just 1.1% of the world population. So that means 56 million individuals control $191.6 trillion in assets. I mean, that's just absolutely insane to think about. And I mean, you want to talk about America. You know, we brought that up, as well as that there was also a survey that was done that 13.61 million households have a net worth of $1 million or more. So that's over 10% of the households in the United States that are worth over $1 million, whereas our poverty rate for 2021 was 13.7%. So you have, you know, 13.6 million people or households in this world with a net worth of 1 million or more. And then you have 13.7% of the population, which actually equates out to a little over 18 million people. And at the end of the day, that's, for some reason or another, people don't find a problem with that. But again, it really comes down to, at the end of the day, those who are making the decisions, they don't want things to change. We could be making changes to the tax code. We could be making changes to ways to redistribute the wealth. But at the end of the day, you know, that's not going to be the case. You know, in redistribution of wealth, it's easy. I mean, you can do it through taxation. You can do it through social protection. You can do it through public services. You can do it through land reform. You can do it through monetary policies, confiscation. I mean, there are lots of different ways where we can redistribute wealth here in this country. Again, the people who are in control are the ones with the money. They don't want that to change in the shape, form, or fashion. So, and another interesting stat that I found is that the median wealth of young families, and that's between 25 and 35 years old, remained relatively stable between 1989 and 2019. In contrast, the wealth of older families, 65 to 75 years old, increased rapidly between 1995 and 2007, and they've since doubled those gains since then. And again, that also goes back to a point Lauren brought up: is it comes down to knowledge. It comes down to knowing how to play the game. And ultimately, if we are not teaching younger generation, we're not teaching younger people about how to fully build wealth, then ultimately wealth gap is, how am I going to say this? I actually don't think the wealth gap is ever going to change, but if we don't enact any policies, it's going to just continue getting wider from there. Let me ask you all, with that being said, and I know I've just given my opinion on it already, do you all think that there's any chance for the wealth gap to either shrink or disappear wholly and entirely, whether that be in our lifetimes or in our kids' lifetimes?
Great question. Though I am an optimist when it comes to pretty much everything, I'm gonna have to say no to that. And this kind of touches on, you know, what both of you said, but maybe a little bit of a twist to it. There is, for us, for that wealth gap to be there, right? For minorities, for, you know, African Americans, the Hispanic community, there is money to be made off of us not having the same amount of wealth, right? When you look at housing practices, when you look at education, Black women are the most educated group, but we're also the biggest group paying the most in student loans. So we're putting billions of dollars towards the federal government every year. There's money to be made off of us thinking that we're doing better. We might be doing better than maybe our parents were doing. We might be doing better than we were doing yesterday, but we're still a commodity. And as long as we are considered a commodity, and you know, I think we hear it, we saw it a couple of weeks ago with, you know, the confirmation hearing for Ketanji Brown Jackson, like we're still considered less than. So there's going to always be practices put in place until you put somebody in office that has the same ideals. There's going to always be practices in place to keep that gap there. And even once the person or people are put in place in office to make sure that this wealth gap shrinks, I mean, there's still greed that you have to deal with, because there are people that are making money. You know, people lobby for a reason. They lobby, you know, to keep those gaps there. So there are people making money off of people being impoverished. So I honestly, I just can't see, like, it may shrink, but I think that's more of it shrinks because we may get some policies put in place as a bone to keep people placated for a little while.
Well, I would say the same reasons for why I agree that it could go away. I think that what we have seen post-Trump era is that the wealth gap has increased significantly, and that is because of the tax codes and how the wealth has been redistributed to decrease taxes and levies and financial incentives for rich corporations for them to continue to make money, right? So you have corporations and rich in America that are paying less taxes than you or I are. And so those are kind of new loopholes that get wider and wider based off of the legislation and how the government has influence over those things. And now we are seeing there is this change towards conservatism, and there are people that are really trying to hold on to the wealth that they have had forever and ever and ever. And we do see more conservative ideologies in terms of not wanting certain groups to profit. But the thing that I think is going to be different in the future is that there are currently now less white males that are going to be in college. There are going to be less white males you know, as CEOs of companies in the Senate, in the House, in the state, in the legislature, and into, you know, probably 2050, we're going to definitely tip the scales, where there's going to be a lot more diversity in America and in general. And so while we don't know how, you know, that's going to play out, we've never had that in our history, where there are going to be so many people that are more persons of color than there are you know, persons that are not. And I think that that's going to have a big influence about how we change and what kind of our values are going forward. But there's no way to tell. But what I can say is that there's definitely more, the wealth gap now is bigger than it was in, let's say, the 80s or even the 90s. There's a more disparity. So that lets me know that there's an opportunity that it can shrink as well in the future. But that's, nobody really knows.
You guys both made fair points, and I mean, I couldn't agree more. As I stated earlier, I'm not certain as to whether or not the wealth gap actually can be erased, not without proper steps that are going to be put in. You know, and I've had lots of discussion with people about this. So, you know, one of the bigger reasons why the wealth gap exists and why it continues to persist are bailout. So the government is willing to bail out corporations, companies, but at the end of the day, when it actually comes to bailing out individual people, they don't do it with the same fervor and zest. So, I mean, let's look at the bank bailouts that happen. You know, if I manage my business imprudently, I go bust. Why should the banking world receive any special favors? It's an example of one rule for some and another for the many. But also to that same end, I understand that without the bank bailouts, the financial service system would crash, and ultimately we'd be looking at, you know, a global meltdown of our economy. And so I can understand the bailouts for the banks to some extent, but why not have a bailout for the people? But again, the biggest reason why the powers that be don't want to bail out for the people is they like the structure that it's in. They enjoy being the one to control. You know, another thing that contributes to it are, you know, inflation. Let me see, looking at this here, since 1971, the money supply has increased 67 times, growing at around 11.5% per year. And the Bank of England uses a measure of inflation called CPI, which tracks the price of certain everyday consumer goods to set interest rate. The problem with that, though, is that CPI only measures the effects around, I think it's around 10% of newly created money. It ignores property and financial assets, where ultimately it's where I think, if I remember correctly, about 76% of newly created money ends up anyway. So prices have risen unchecked. It's one reason why we've seen runaway housing prices in the market recently. And it's great if you own property, great if you own financial assets, but it's terrible if you don't. Also looking at government subsidies. So there are companies and whatnot that receive government subsidies not produce things. So they're receiving assistance, but again, the people on the lower end of the spectrum, they're not receiving the assistance. So I guess to answer the question, do I think that the wealth gap will go away? I don't. I actually think that it's going to get larger and larger. Until, and if I'm not mistaken, I was looking at something earlier, it said that by 2030, the richest 1% will own 2/3 of global wealth. And that's similar to the number that I gave earlier, that I think it's around 56 right now, control 1% of, or 1% control 56% of the world's wealth. You know, by 2030, they're saying it's going to be 2/3. And Lauren brought up a good point as well, of looking at it from the standpoint of increases of populations among certain groups here in the United States and decreases in population. Said of getting those people in power. You know, we could have a majority in the United States of Black and brown people, but until those Black and brown people are the ones who are in office making the laws and making the policies, then we're not going to see a seismic shift. So with that being said, we're going to move on to, and we've kind of touched on it, but I really want to get everybody's insight. Is there a real solution, like a tangible solution to why the wealth gap exists and why it persists? And is there a real tangible solution that can actually?
So I think Yeah, there are definitely tangible solutions, right? There's no one solution though. There is going to have to be, multi-tiered, it's many things you're going to have to do in order to correct it. When we're looking at the Black and Brown communities, and I think this goes back to the point you were making, Raymond, about education. We're looking at the Black and Brown communities, and in our communities, our income is half as much as the white community. And this is what the Federal Reserve was saying as late as, I want to say, December of last year. And in the Black and Brown community, we own about 15 to 20% of total wealth, right? One of the things I would venture to ask someone coming out of college, somebody in their 20s, somebody maybe even in their early 30s, do you understand the difference between income and wealth? Right? Do we really understand what wealth is? Just because you make more money, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have wealth. So part of us being able to increase our wealth is to have an understanding of what wealth is. Like, and not just for us, but in order to be able to build generational wealth. A lot of people in the white community, they have this wealth that is passed down, and we call it old money, right? They have this wealth that has been passed down year after year after year, generation after generation. We got grandma's recipes. We don't have stocks and bonds. I mean, tell me I'm lying, right? Like we don't have stocks and bonds. We don't have, we don't have these CDs and everything else that we're learning about now. The different, savings accounts and a business that may have been passed down from generation to generation. We don't have a full understanding of what it means to be wealthy, what it means to have equity in your home. What does it mean to actually have an asset? And instead, a lot of times we are just killing ourselves with credit cards. We have, high interest rates on that. We have liabilities elsewhere, but we don't actually have assets and wealth. So I think, going back to what you said, Brandon, is one of the main things is making sure that we're educating ourselves, because if you know how to do better, then you will do better.
Absolutely. Thinking about it rationally, there are ways that it can be fixed. The biggest thing that we've got to do is reduce the loopholes for the super rich. And that goes back to reforming the tax code. Our tax code, if I'm not mistaken, is 21,506, which is absolutely ridiculous. The tax code is that long. It makes no sense, and there's no point in it. Literally, the tax code is, I think, 12 and a half times the number of words that are in the Bible. I didn't necessarily bring religion into it, but the Bible is the best-selling book of all time. And the fact that it has 12.5 times less words than our tax code is absolutely insane. Making change to the tax code is essential. The rich are becoming exponentially richer by reinvesting their tax breaks and milking the system. At the end of the day, many of America's highest earners even think we should take steps to close all the loopholes so that everyone pays a fair share. And if we use the increased tax money to fund programs like public education, savings programs, it could increase everyone's access to potential wealth. Another thing that has to do with it, and we talked about this a little bit, is limit donations to politicians. Ultimately, right now, politicians can be bought, and they are the ones who make the policies. And if you have enough money, you ultimately can buy your way into what it is that you want. Limiting political donations can help with this. And the biggest thing we talk about this time and time again is education, improving the public education system. That's really where it's got to start. A lot of the uber rich have access to private education, and some of these private education are considered some of the best in the world. Whereas, you have a school that's in inner city Detroit who doesn't have the same funding, who doesn't have the same access to information, doesn't have the same quality of teachers, and they're teaching information to these kids that is limited in scope. And so you've got to start with education. I think that's part of it. And I think lastly, the biggest thing we can do is, and Alexis, you mentioned this, Lauren, you mentioned this, passing along information, teaching people at younger and younger and younger ages what it means to be wealthy, how to accumulate wealth, how to grow your wealth, how to have generational wealth. There are things that we've talked about beforehand is that, there are things that some people are taught early on in age in life, not later on in life. And we learn many things in life, be a life lessons and whatnot stuff, but having the knowledge and the understanding of wealth, of the financial service system, can actually make a difference in closing the wealth. In my opinion.
Yes, I would agree with both of your points. I think that if we think about the wealth in America as a big giant pie, there's no reason why we should be squabbling about 20% of that pie when we have other people, communities that hold the rest of the entire pie. And so if we were to do things, like Brandon mentioned, with putting more taxes on the rich, making a lot more distribution of wealth, then you would have the funding for your education. You'd have funding to do the initiatives that you needed to. I mean, just imagine in your own budget if there was just more money in your budget, and that could come not just simply from income, but there are other opportunities that we could be taught and learn that would redistribute that wealth. And I think that's really paramount. And when we really think about changes for our community and education and all the things that we want, it is of premier importance that we really consider that distribution of wealth. I think that's a real tangible thing that we are going to have an uphill battle for, but you have to. That's what it is that we need before any other thing. So I agree with both of you.
That is great, and just want to say I appreciate everybody here. And ultimately, that's all we have for today's Black Advancement discussion. I want to thank Alexis. I want to thank Lauren for joining this panel so that we could have a discussion on why the wealth gap currently exists. And so that's all today for today's Black Struggle. Want to thank you for watching. You can see this and more at Black Advancement YouTube channel or at the website, which is www.blackadvancement.com. Until next time, peace and advance. Appreciate everybody.